Welcome to the Antidote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCann.
And this is Jeremy Roth Cushell.
Jeremy, as you brought to my attention, I'm sadly uninformed in this regard. Today is Constitution Day. And I was thinking with regards to the Constitution of that all-important oath to protect and defend the Constitution and defend our republic against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I think that you can put a major emphasis on both foreign and domestic in terms of what we're discussing today, and that is I believe this is the fourth part of our series from 9/11 to 11/9, where we're looking back, I think, with the benefit of hindsight at September 11th and the events of September 11th, as well as the benefit of hindsight of the November 2016 election of Donald Trump, and tying that in with current events and kind of, I think, building a bigger picture and bringing it all together. And in the process of this, you find a lot of what I think can be classified as enemies. Certainly on the domestic front, but a lot of enemies on the maybe they would actually be both foreign and domestic, in that they certainly do represent foreign entities in this case, but have a very strong domestic foothold in the United States. And, when we started this series, we were already looking at it in the lens of, the 11/9 election or the day of, the morning of 11/9 in correlation with 9/11 was actually the morning that Donald Trump was declared president. And in that, we were going to tie in these events of 9/11 and 11/9 kind of, in a lot of ways, as being a continuation. In some ways, 11/9 and the 2016 election was a continuation of 9/11 in terms of the various parties and entities that were involved in much of at least what was going on in New York City in the lead up to and on September 11th. And then major correlation and tying in with people, whether it was in media, whether it's in government politics, whether it's in international mafia and business networks that really played a major instrumental role in electing Donald Trump. But I think when we started this series a few weeks back, I don't know if I think we may have underestimated just some of the depths of some of these of these connections. And it's not to say that, Donald Trump himself is or is not, like, we're not trying to, put responsibility for the September 11th on Donald Trump's lap. I don't think that would be fair, obviously. But when you look, you literally turn any rock. I call it, like, let's say the proverbial phrase, there's something under every rock. I mean, literally with Donald Trump and literally with pretty much anyone that surrounds him, you open up any rock you open, you're going to find a connection to either Israel, you're going to find a connection to this Russian, Israeli, Zionist mafia, and literally every single rock, any aspect of Donald Trump's life you look into, of his political campaign that you look into, of his real estate work, of his days as a mogul you look into, you're going to find those connections. They're there everywhere. And in regards to even to the September 11th operation and the continuation with a lot of what's going on in the world now, as I look at the interests that are representing, that Donald Trump represents, people behind him, people around him at literally every level in any aspect of his life. I look at these people as representing a continuation of a long-term agenda that September 11th was a major part of. And I think now you can not so much root, but certainly a major aspect of there's a major correlation between the September 11th operation, at least various aspects out of it, out of the New York City operation, which I think very much centered around an Israeli, not just an Israeli, but an international Zionist network. And then you see so many of the same interests in this network around and surrounding Donald Trump in so many ways. And so there's a lot of areas we could take this conversation. We have a lot of things that we want to tie in with this, and just in terms of just the depths of this conversation, because we originally labeled quote unquote Russia Gate as Israel Gate. But I think we underestimated just the actual, in a lot of ways, Russian connections and also just the international global scope of this operation. I don't quite know what I want to call it at this point in general, but there's a number of areas we could go with this in tying these dots and connecting all of these two very, I think, world-changing events back to each other. And Jeremy, I'm going to give you I know you have a number of areas you want to touch on. I'm going to give you the floor as to where you want to take this conversation in terms of what you want to focus on to start with.
Well, on Constitution Day, I like the fact that you put it as protect and defend the Constitution, and that a lot of people talk about the oath-sworn soldiers of the United States military and how that is the oath that they take. But the other side of this, too, is that we also uphold what the Constitution in its best aspects protects, which is our natural, inherent, some might say God-given rights that are protected underneath the Bill of Rights. And once again, First Amendment is first. And so this means that things like speech and press, and remember, speech is also, there is something implied in speech that also has to do with thought, analysis, dialogue is an aspect of it. That these are where we can make our stand. This is where we not only are able to make the union more perfect, if we were to talk about it in that way, but these are also our prime tools at this point in the midst of what is really a global information war that does have physical components to it, but at a high level, there's an information war aspect to this that I think is front and center. So in order to not only protect and defend the Constitution, but to uphold it and utilize it, I think it comes down to things like the First Amendment, speech and press, and the analysis that underlies all of that, and how we can reason together, and how can we root out not only deception, but criminality and wickedness, especially in high places where it cascades down upon the heads of we the people globally. So let's go about doing that. And as you pointed out, this 9/11 to 11/9 series of analyses that we're working on is beginning to get deeper and deeper and wider in many ways. And because we're not going to hear about these really serious connections from people like Michael Moore, from his film Fahrenheit 9/11, or his newest film Fahrenheit 11/9. And by the way, does he still have the same Ari Emanuel, son of the Irgun agent in Hollywood, who, by the way, is, as we pointed out from way back, is Donald Trump's buddy in Hollywood? I don't know. But what I'll bet you is that Fahrenheit 11/9 by Michael Moore is not going to tell you anything about this, about the nature of the continuity of the operation from those behind 9/11 to those behind 11/9. And I think it is fair to say that some of our early analysis in terms of Trump representing the placement into the executive by certain hardline foreign Israeli elements in many ways, for the first time. And that, yes, the Israel has had a very strong influence, especially through its domestic Jewish power elements for a long, long time. But in terms of as a political entity, I think it is the case that there has not been an executive, a president of the United States of America, who was really put there completely by that aspect of Israel. And I think we do see that now with Trump. So because the Michael Moores are not going to give us the fullness of how hot this 9/11 to 11/9 operation really is, then we should do it ourselves. And it's heating up a lot. If people would actually just go take a look at the Mueller, some of the Mueller facts that have been put on the legal record now in relationship to now agreement with one Paul Manafort, the campaign head of Donald Trump's campaign in 2016. And a lot is being made right now that Donald Trump doesn't even know Paul Manafort. and but they've known each other for 30 years. And so Donald Trump knows exactly what Paul Manafort's background is, and I would assert that knew what the operation represented in many ways. But let's dig into a couple of the key pieces of what's actually having been put on the legal record now. And by the way, we're not only not going to get it from certain aspects of the liberals, whether it's Michael Moore or even the progressives to the left, like people like Aaron Mate, who wrote up a whole poo-poo piece in The Nation to follow up on his really non-interview in relationship to Luke Harding's book Collusion, in relationship to the factuality of the deep Russian mob and Russian government compromise aspects in relationship to Donald Trump. So you're not going to get it from them, but you're also not going to get it from the Alex Jones, who spent yesterday railing about how Brett Kavanaugh came to Austin and raped me. And the disparaging of these allegations against Kavanaugh from his high school days by a woman who's now fully come out with her name and all of that is just disgusting. And over, we see that that's what this Trump operation in many ways has been built from. And we recognize this and analyze how this was in some ways spiritually a compromise operation in relationship to the Christian patriot right in many ways. And I would say more and more we're seeing this as a very, there's a lot of wickedness in the mix, and there's a lot of sort of cowardice thugs in the mix here in relationship to women. And the stories keep coming out about the abusers in the administration and the alleged sexual predators in the administration. And go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to say with regards to this, I mean, Trump or Alex Jones previously dismissed any allegations against Trump. Oh, the women who are accusing him aren't attractive enough for him. And now it's Brett Kavanaugh. And, it's amazing to me just the psychological manipulation, just how effective this has been, and that Trump and the network surrounding him his entire life, everything he's been involved in, just so vastly unbelievably contradictory to the values that his supporters profess to believe in. It amazes me just how contradictory this is and just how successful this operation has been to make Trump into the exact opposite of what he actually represents in every way, shape, and form.
Yes, and for this sort of to be somehow papered over, these allegations by a woman who basically says that she's taken a lie detector test too, that basically has now said that what she says she believes to be true, that from high school she had an encounter with Brett Kavanaugh where everyone was drunk, and he and his friend teamed up to turn the music really loud and to put his hand over her mouth while she tried to scream and to attempt to assault her. And people and large portions of the Republicans are saying this is just a sort of a game at the end, and that was a childhood indiscretion and stuff like that. I know back in my group of friends back in high school, if anything like that was heard about at our school, you could imagine a serious talking to, not some type of chalking it up to indiscretion. So this is disgusting. This is in many ways a war on women. And in the meanwhile, there's a bunch of cowardly men pretending to be alpha males when they're just little bitches. And we refer to the bitch wars of the Russian crime syndicates from back in Stalin's day. We won't go into that now, but maybe in the future we'll reference that, whether this is the 21st century's version of the bitch wars.
Indeed. And so in a way, I know you've come forth with the hypothesis, a theory that based on what we've seen with Kavanaugh and some of the connections that he appears to have, is that I think this is as valid of a theory as anything else, that Kavanaugh is being nominated for a Supreme Court seat in large part to run cover for the kind of things that are going on right now in regards to this Russiagate investigation, which of course a lot of people just want to continue to poo-poo, but it's, as we've said, it's just far, far more than that. And it does appear at some level that Brett Kavanaugh could very well be a cover artist for some of what's going on here. And also, you've also linked Kavanaugh to September 11th and the black and white, what was it, the checkered suit he was wearing, or his wife's outfit, and various things there. So, I mean, it does appear that Kavanaugh could very well be a cover-up artist, and considering the kind of interest covering up for and the kind of things that are coming out about a Paul Manafort that would, at some, link him through his family's construction business to aspects of September 11th cover-up. And Paul Manafort is someone whose role, I think, in all of this maneuvering with, not just with Donald Trump, but with events going on in Eastern Europe over the last decade or so, I think has been so almost criminally underreported. As much as disproportionate attention as, say, Steve Bannon got for his role in the Trump campaign, Paul Manafort's was just as ignored and underrepresented. And so it's a positive that I think we're really zeroing in on Paul Manafort at this point in time. And
yes, and over we see these guys with these questionable relationships to their family and their wives. Whether it was the Bolton story in terms of Plato's Retreat, I think it was called, and that whole thing, or this Kavanaugh, or Manafort, the stories are there too, or definitely Donald Trump. So this is definitely a nasty, swampy, disgusting mix in the fold here. And Kavanaugh, the story is disturbing, and also when you combine it, not only the questions about Kavanaugh's missing debt, does he have a gambling problem? This allegation from back in the day, and when he was asked about what he wanted to be proud of when he looked back on his life, he had to be prompted to talk about being a good husband. He'd completely forgotten that thing. And so there's a whole range of issues here, but in the background also is this relationship of the Trump family to Justice Kennedy's family. And both the sons are tied in. There's very tight connections. Go look at that. Even, aspects of the mainstream media has covered that aspect, which includes things like Deutsche Bank, the multi-billion dollars of money laundering via aspects of Russian oligarchs and Russian mob, and basically one of the few bankers who would do business with Donald Trump domestically in the U.S. After he had gone bankrupt multiple times. And one Justin Kennedy, I believe, Justice Kennedy's son, was working there at that time and had a close relationship with Donald Trump. But it doesn't stop there. But people can find all of that. But now Manafort is really front and center in relationship to these documents. And what we've seen is there's some two key pieces that are being touched on in terms of this latest document. And I first want to get into one that has to do with this idea of influence peddling or buying media and weaponizing anti-Semitism. And so this is in the mix here. And I would just point out that this is there's aspects of the Mueller investigation here that if people know where to look, they would, it sounds very much like some of the analysis that the Antidote has been doing for a long, long time in relationship to the weaponization of anti-Semitism and the accusations of the weaponization, the accusations of anti-Semitism, and how there's this strange relationship to aspects of the sort of what we might call the fake nationalist right that sometimes flirts with anti-Semitism, and the right-wing Israeli Jewish Zionist power structure. And so this is now becoming legally front and center for those who have the eyes to see. So I'm just going to read a little bit from this superseding criminal information document that was put out in relationship to the Manafort agreement to work with the special prosecutor. And it talks about a report that that Manafort was working on in relationship to the government of Ukraine and to attempt to demonize the former leader Timoshenko. And there's this whole background here of the idea of the lock her up, lock her up, lock her up as being part of the mass psychological warfare that was being used. So number 36, Manafort and others knew that the actual cost of the report and the scope of the law firm's work would undermine the report's being perceived as an independent assessment and thus being an effective lobbying tool for Manafort to use to support the incarceration of President Yanukovych's political opponent. 37. In addition to the law firm report, Manafort took other steps on behalf of the government of Ukraine to tarnish Timoshenko in the United States. In addition to disseminating stories about her soliciting murder noted above in October 2012, Manafort orchestrated a scheme to have, as he wrote in a contemporaneous communication, quote, Obama Jews, unquote, put pressure on the administration to disavow Timoshenko and support Yanukovych. Manafort sought to undermine United States support for Timoshenko by spreading stories in the United States that a senior cabinet official who had been a prominent critic of Yanukovych's treatment of Timoshenko was supporting anti-Semitism because the official supported Timoshenko, who in turn had formed a political alliance with the Ukraine party that espoused anti-Semitic views. Manafort coordinated privately with a senior Israeli government official to issue a written statement publicizing this story. Manafort then, with secret advance knowledge of that Israeli statement, worked to disseminate this story in the United States, writing to person D1, quote, I have someone pushing it on the New York Post, bada bing, bada boom, unquote. Manafort sought to have the administration understand that, quote, the Jewish community will take this out on Obama on Election Day if he does nothing, unquote. Manafort then told his United States lobbyists to inform the administration that Ukraine had worked to prevent the administration's presidential opponent from including damaging language in the Israeli statement so as not to harm the administration and thus further ingratiate Yanukovych with the administration. So what's interesting here, too, is you go to Richard Silverstein's Tikkun Olam. It talks about Manafort's dirty ops Ukraine campaign pioneered methods later used in the Trump campaign. And I'm just going to read a little bit this here. It goes over that same story there. The former Trump campaign chair also enlisted Avigdor Lieberman, then foreign minister, to release a statement reinforcing the charges of Timoshenko collusion with Ukrainian anti-Semitism. This lent the charge an air of gravitas it would ordinarily lack. It would also lend credence to the charges among the quote-unquote Obama Jews Manafort was attempting to persuade to lobby the president against Timoshenko. Lieberman's official statement was fed by Manafort's cronies to Breitbart's Ben Shapiro, who regurgitated it there, invented, quote, and all. Lieberman has denied any involvement in the scheme. Quote, Lieberman, who is currently defense minister, denied on Friday that he had ever met with, spoken to, or worked with Manafort. Of course, Manafort would not have approached Lieberman directly. He would have permitted his Russian co-conspirators to do that for him, and Lieberman is smart enough to ensure there would be no fingerprints on the statement that linked its publication to outside influence. Thus, Lieberman's quote-unquote denial is nothing of the sort. And Mueller also contradicts Lieberman. Manafort coordinated privately with the senior Israeli governmental official to issue a written statement publicizing this story. And then just a few more things here. Lieberman's role is especially interesting since Israeli intelligence officials have, in the past, refused to brief him on sensitive matters, fearing he might compromise them. Lieberman is known to have an especially close relationship with the Kremlin, including Putin himself. Even after Netanyahu began his own intensive shuttle diplomacy with Russia to coordinate Israel's approach to Syria, Lieberman continued his own high-level meetings there at least once a year or more. Once, a mysterious flyer was posted on the streets of Jerusalem, explicitly accusing Lieberman of being a Russian intelligence asset. Ronen Bergman and others have documented the penetration of the Israeli military, political echelon, and intelligence services by Russian intelligence. If any of this is true, it would make perfect sense for the Kremlin to enlist the former Moldovan to smear Timoshenko. No doubt Lieberman would owe them a favor and be happy to repay it with such a bogus claim smearing the Ukrainian opposition leader. So it's pretty interesting because first of all, if you follow some of Richard Silverstein's work too, he's done interesting write-ups about this background of the one article back from December 10th, 2016 is titled "KGB Infiltrated Highest Echelons of Israel's Army, Business, and Political Leadership." I'm just going to read the very beginning here, which might sort of point to why we're not hearing some aspects of this.
This was the article that I believe Mint Press News refused to publish.
Well, that's what I was going to read here. Just going to read this note. I originally wrote this piece for Mint Press News. Its editor, Manar Muhawesh, killed the piece, which caused me to sever my relationship with Mint Press, an outlet I contributed to for several years. These are hard blows, but one's independent journalists face it regularly. I know I have. So it is very interesting that seems to be the touchy subject. Mint Press News always deals with aspects of Israeli policy, Israeli crimes, but then this question about this connection or this infiltration even of the Soviet sphere in relationship to the Israeli sphere seems to be an intensely touchy subject.
It is interesting that a lot of cases, Mint Press News will go further than a lot of, left progressive leaning anti-Zionist publications will go, publish work by people like Alison Weir. But even for a lot of people in that type of camp that's willing to go further than a lot of your, foundation, Palestinian solidarity types, still this seems to be, the Russia thing is too much even for a lot of these people. So.
Yes, and then just a couple older follow-up stories that Richard Silverstein published in relationship to this question of Lieberman, Avigdor Lieberman, in relationship to the Russian government is November 10th, 2011. Shin Bet withheld Iran secrets from Lieberman as a security risk. Israel Defense, the publication which covers the Israeli defense industry, reports that when Avigdor Lieberman was Minister for Strategic Affairs in an earlier iteration of the Netanyahu government, the Shin Bet, which reviews and approves security clearances, refused to approve access to some of the nation's secret information about Iran. In contrast, the current minister filling that portfolio, Moshe Ya'alon, has full access. So that's pretty interesting. And Strategic Affairs, Ministry of Strategic Affairs, remember, is related very much to things like foreign propaganda, especially in relationship to criticism of Israel and boycott, divestment, sanctions. So that's interesting that he was heading that up. And then one last article, also from 2011, Lieberman severs ties with Mossad. So this is pretty interesting about the questions about whether Lieberman is some type of mole of some sort. And then how does that tie in not only to, obviously, Russian intelligence, but how does that tie in relationship to this Russian mob question? And specifically the way it's tied together in terms of Russian-Israeli and then into New York as a Russian-Jewish mob. And why is that the sort of the touchy subject here? So that's a big deal. That question about the coordination of Paul Manafort in relationship to Yanukovych, and then there's of course these Russian oligarchs such as Dmitry Firtash. And there's a lot of questions about resources and gas and relationship to skimming money from national resources, tied back into Putin and Russia's intelligence. But then now we have this coordination aspect with potentially someone like Ben Shapiro, then writing for one Breitbart. And the way that this, and of course, this makes a lot of sense in terms of what we've been tracking this whole time. The beginning of the investigation, the first publicized indictment, or the big one I remember was was the Flynn indictment, and maybe that was after the Manafort indictment. But the Flynn indictment was very interesting, right? Because it was about trying to undermine the then current U.S. administration's of policy in regards to Israel, while working with the Russians to do so. So there's a lot of overlap here. This one seems to be much more about Russia, or about Russian interests in using Russian potential assets in Israel to do so in relationship to Jewish assets in the United States.
Yeah, indeed. And so with this though, you're really seeing and also with even with Paul Manafort, you have the connections to this Simeon, is it Mogilevich? Is that how you pronounce his last name? Was referred to by, I believe it was Robert Friedman, the author of Red Mafia, as how do you refer to him, as the mob boss of mob bosses?
Yeah, the Dawn of Dawns, the brainy Dawn.
The man said to be the man who has the goods on Viktor Orban, which is said to have led to his political conversion from, Western allied liberal to hardcore Zionist supporter of Putin in Russia as well as Israel. And it is a who's who here, but this is very significant that once again, and I didn't understand the depths of the Ukraine thing. Like, I realized, we started to question. What got me to start questioning the narrative the generic standard alternative media narrative on Russia were these articles that we looked back on, I think early last year, that were published in the aftermath of the of Russia taking back Crimea from the Ukraine, and which coincided with the ouster of Viktor Yushchenko being ran out of Ukraine. He fled and gave up power. We realized at the time, there's a problem here. The article that we read from in a couple of our past shows on Ukraine, there's a disagreement. American neoconservatives don't see eye to eye with Israel, and I think that's where we began to identify that there's this split within the neoconservative movement, which I think explains so much of the pro-Trump versus never-Trump aspect in within the GOP establishment. But even taking all that into consideration, I don't think we quite got the depths of this. The depths of this operation as far as the Israeli-Ukrainian-Russian relationship, and how complicated it is that you do have two very distinct sides, and that there's a major split within this organized Jewish community. But what we've seen with the it doesn't just go back to March 2014. It goes back way before that, and you're seeing this coordinated effort here with, at some level, there had to be some coordination between elements of the Israeli government that Paul Manafort was in touch with, Paul Manafort and his people, perhaps Russians who were involved in this, and then an obvious right-wing, I would say, Israeli operative within the right-wing media, such as Ben Shapiro at Breitbart. And you're getting this this nexus here, and I think it also sheds a lot of light on why these on why the right-wing Zionists in Israel, not just what you think of as Israel or the Israeli government, but the right-wing elements that are, I think, very much in control and have a ton of influence under Benjamin Netanyahu, why they support all of these right-wing governments in Europe and the divide in the Jewish community there. It's because I think they see these right-wing governments that they certainly do have There's a lot of talk about culture and about right-wing Christian in a lot of ways values, but these right-wing Zionists see these Western right-wing Christian espousing, value espousing governments as being much more preferable to the more liberalized globalist outlook, which I think inevitably leads to a lot of backlash against Zionism due to the inherent within liberalism. I think there's an inherent tendency to criticize oppressors, and that would certainly happen with the situation with the Palestinians. But it also, and then once again, it ties into Trump, and that you can see why in the eyes of a lot of these right-wing Zionists, these real hardcore proponents of a religious type of Zionism, why they would see someone like Donald Trump, for all of his obvious, I think, flaws and possible unpredictability in the wild card aspect of him as being preferable over just more of the same standard neoliberalism, which is leading to societies moving leftward, and which is also in the process of this is turning people against an obvious oppressive colonialistic type of ideology as Zionism. So I think we're seeing this come together here. And the other thing is that as we just said before, there's so many of these tie-ins to the 9/11 operation, to the 11/9 operation, not just from a physical perspective, but certainly from a perspective of shaping and manipulating the narratives from this far right wing perspective. And I don't know if you wanted to follow up at all on talking about this before we move into some other figures that we can tie back into both of these. The September 11th and the Donald Trump presidency.
Well, I just wanted to follow up by getting back into the weeds in relationship to what's now been we can see now more clearly in relationship to this latest legal document that has to do with these ties to Russian mob and Mogilevich, as you said, and so this company Lusical is basically it's mentioned many times, and what's listed is all these payments that Manafort was doing in relationship to a lot of activities, and it looks like he's this is part and parcel of his crimes that he's been indicted for. But this Lusical Consultants company, even way back in the first indictment, it was being noticed that this tied Manafort directly into this Don, Semyon Mogilevich. And by the way, there is video of Mogilevich at close to Putin, basically in the campaign headquarters, I think, during one of Putin's wins. So he is protected. He is deeply involved at the highest levels of Putin's government. Apparently, is what it looks like to me. So here's an article way back last year. Mueller reveals new Manafort link to organized crime. Trump's former campaign manager didn't just do business with accused gangsters. One of them transferred millions into a Manafort account allegedly used for money laundering. Buried deep in Robert Mueller's indictment of Paul Manafort is a new link between Donald Trump's former campaign and Russian organized crime. The indictment, unsealed on Monday, and remember this is last year, includes an extensive look into Paul Manafort's Byzantine financial dealings. In particular, it details how he used a company called Lusical Consultants Limited to wire millions of dollars into the United States. The Cyprus-based Lusical Consultants Limited, in turn, reportedly received millions of dollars from a businessman and Ukrainian...
Cyprus again.
Yes, exactly. An Ukrainian parliamentarian named Ivan Fursin, who is closely linked to one of Russia's most notorious criminals, Semyon Mogilevich. Mogilevich is frequently described as the most dangerous mobster in the world, currently believed to be safe in Moscow. He is, according to the FBI, responsible for weapons trafficking, contract killings, and international prostitution. In 2009, he made the Bureau's 10 most wanted fugitives list. And as an aside, there's also aspects of the new information that puts Tony Podesta in the midst of it also. So this is not just a partisan, operation here. This is bipartisan. This is about corruption. And there is a wide net now being cast. And this is why I want people who should be involved to be involved in this investigation. So if you think about if this were 9/11 and we're at basically 2003 in 9/11, we're in the heart of the 9/11 Commission. And imagine if we'd all had information about what 9/11 really was at that point, and how we could intervene to make sure that such things were not allowed to be just pure cover-ups. And so I think we're at the same type of situation here in terms of the 11/9 investigation. And this is much more a legal investigation, so there's a lot more teeth to it. But yes, Mueller's involved, and clearly Mueller at the very least, did not hold the 9/11 criminals to account. In many ways, it probably looks like he acted as he has in the past, as some type of political fixer, potentially. So we need to be involved here to make sure that the totality of the factual truth comes out here. And so I just want to urge us to be involved in that way. And there are some interesting questions, that are answered about Donald Trump's actual Russian ties. And I can't believe that people are still in denial of all of this. It's so massive and it's so obvious. There's an interesting article actually from LinkedIn that we've looked at before, I believe, they're called the 1995 Gangster Meeting in Israel that blows open the Trump-Russia saga. That sort of talks about the Felix Sater relationship, the Bogatin, and also Semyon Mogilevich was there, tied into this Boris Burshteyn, the Russian-Canadian businessman. So this makes me want to look at, before we go into 9/11 a little more directly, let's focus a little bit more on these 11/9 ties. And this book by the House of Trump, House of Putin by Craig Unger. At the very end, he has a list of the Trump's 59 Russia connections. I just want to read through a few of them really quickly to sort of tell you what's going on here. A lot of these characters are people that we've been, putting forth and investigating a little bit here at The Antidote. Donald Trump has repeatedly said he has nothing to do with Russia. Below are 59 Trump connections to Russia. 1. Roman Abramovich, a Putin confidant billionaire who, along with fellow oligarch Lev Leviev, created the Putin-approved Federation of Jewish Communities of Russia under the leadership of Chabad Rabbi Beryl Lazar, a.k.a. Putin's rabbi, unquote. Ivanka Trump is close to Abramovich's ex-wife, Dasha Zukova, and has taken several trips with the Abramoviches, including a trip to Russia in 2014 as their guests. Then there's the Agalarovs. They are, of course, central to the 2013 Miss Universe pageant, and also in terms of the Trump Tower June 2016 meeting. Then you have number 4, Evsei Agron, the first alleged boss of the Russian mafia in Brighton Beach. Agron came to New York in 1975 and ran his crime gang out of Brooklyn's El Caribe Country Club. What does this have to do with Donald Trump, which was owned by Dr. Morton Levine and his family, including nephew Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer? 5. Rinat Akhmetshin, former Soviet counterintelligence officer who became a K Street lobbyist working to end the sanctions. Akhmetshin attended the Trump Tower meeting with Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and others in June 2016, at which a Russian lawyer promised to provide opposition research on Hillary Clinton. According to the New York Times, Akhmetshin had also worked in Kiev with Konstantin Kilimnik, an aide to Paul Manafort, who had a background in Russian intelligence. Then there's Tawfiq Arif, who we talked about before, Marat Balagula, who is also involved with the El Caribe Country Club, still owned by Michael Cohen and his uncle. Balagula partnered with David Bogatin, who had previously purchased 5 apartments in Trump Tower. 8. Boris Burshteyn, who I mentioned before, Russian-Canadian, who founded Cibico SA with KGB operatives and under KGB guidelines to set up corporations abroad. Worked with son-in-law Alex Schneider, who later built Trump Tower in Toronto. And 2/3 of the Eurasian Natural Resources Corporation's trio, Patok Chodiev and Alexander Mashkovich. Burshteyn hosted the famous 1995 summit meeting in Tel Aviv, at which Semyon Mogilevich was allotted an enormous share of the Ukraine energy trade. And there's a deeper backstory there that we'll get into in future shows that has to do potentially with things like who was supporting certain aspects of the Israeli political sector with resources. And then more and more it had to do with this Russian Jewish mob. And then this was also at the time where a rabbi, a Chabad-linked rabbi in New York, put a spiritual hit out on Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, or President, was he a Prime Minister, I think, Yitzhak Rabin, right before he was assassinated.
Yeah, he's prime minister.
So number 9, David. So there is this question here: is whether Russian organized crime, and specifically in interfacing with the Jewish mob in relationship to the Israeli government, played a certain role in relationship to the setting up of the Likud government and Netanyahu as a key actor in anticipation of things like September 11th and the ongoing war of terror, and obviously now 11/9 too. So And so that was all about the Ukraine energy trade, which keeps on showing up here, which is, again, where are the left so-called anti-imperialists on investigating this incredible oligarchy of vulture billionaires who have apparently taken over the executive branch of the U.S. government. We have our own domestic vulture billionaires who are also part of this, but there's this whole other set. Number 9, David Bogatin, one of the pioneers behind the Red Daisy gas tax scam. Bogatin bought 5 apartments in Trump Tower for $6 million in 1984, in the process becoming the first alleged Russian mobster to launder money through Trump Tower. Donald Trump personally sold the apartments to Bogatin. Then another Bogatin brother, 11, Oleg Boyko, Russian oligarch who was close to Boris Yeltsin, who purchased the Trump Tower apartment in 1994, which he later sold to Vadim Trincher. And I believe Trincher is involved with an organized crime group that was rolled up in relationship to the Fort Lee geography, which is key to 9/11, which I'd like to cover next in relationship to some other connections here. But then just a few last ones here. 12, Mikhail Chernoy, billionaire oligarch who ran Trans World Group with his brother Lev, gained control of Russia's aluminum industry and required a huge stake in processing and distributing other metals and petroleum products. Chernoy allegedly defrauded the Russian central bank of more than $100 million and is believed by the FBI to be a major Russian crime figure. In the 90s, Chernoy worked with the Chodiev Group. Chernoy also worked with Semyon Kislin, who had a long relationship with Trump and who partnered with Tamir Sapir, a financier of Trump Soho. 13, Vitaly Churkin, Russian ambassador to the UN. Churkin met Trump in 86 along with Yuri Dubinin, set up the trip Trump took to Moscow in 1987. Churkin died in 2017 in New York. And then is Michael Cohen. But there's a lot more here, and it should be pointed out in terms of this is bigger than Donald Trump and this bigger than the Republicans and all of that. There was this question of in the back that Mogilevich had Americans, high-powered Americans, operating on his behalf. So here's from the Moscow Times in 2007. Deripaska Mogilevich hired top U.S. lobbyists, Wall Street Journal said. A number of high-profile Russian and Ukrainian businessmen have hired top names in U.S. politics as lobbyists as they seek to improve their image in the West amid allegations of shady dealings, the Wall Street Journal. The billionaire Oleg Deripaska has retained former Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole since 2003 to lobby the U.S. State Department to grant him a visa. Then down below it says, the newspaper also said former FBI Chief William Sessions was acting as a lawyer to Semyon Mogilevich, the Ukrainian-born Russian who is on the FBI's most wanted list over his purported organized crime links. Wow. So here you go. I mean, this is, and then just a little bit down in here, Sessions is lobbying the U.S. Department of Justice as it investigates charges of racketeering against Mogilevich for involvement in shady energy deals between Russia and Ukraine, the newspaper said. The paper also reported that IT and Communications Minister Leonid Raimon had hired Washington consultant Mark DeAnastasio to help him fight a U.S. investigation into allegations of money laundering. Meanwhile, Mikhail Friedman's Alpha Group, which has had a long-running legal battle with allies of Rieman's over the fate of a blocking stake in telecom firm Megaphone, paid nearly $2 million in fees to lobby group Barber, Griffith, and Rogers. So the collusion here and the corruption is very widespread in relationship to this investigation. So, Greg, any quick comments before I just launch a little bit into this question of 9/11 Fort Lee and how this all connects?
I think we're going to go back to this. I think we're going to do another show after this, and we're going to go back to this topic because I'll allude to something we're going to talk to in the. I think we're going to talk about our next show, and that is going to be a very, very interesting. Because we talked last week, and where I think the actual I think real common thread that you can use to tie this kind of this Jewish Russian Zionist Israeli, whatever you want to call it, global kind of mafia network with an event like September 11th, and the whole Russia angle, where I think the Russian angle really comes in with September 11th, is in relation to this Center for the National Interest, which has the honorary board member Hank Greenberg, and also is Dov Zakheim is on the board, or is a fellow at the Center for the National Interest, which promotes better relations with Russia. So I think in that regard, we have Greenberg. His son was the head of Marsh McLennan, which hundreds of employees died while he was the CEO of Marsh McLennan, while the person who was the head in terms of the operational office space inside within the World Trade Center. Paul Bremer had hundreds of his employees die while on TV he's saying that bin Laden was responsible for 9/11. And we were tying this in with some interesting connections we made with Michael Flynn receiving an award, I believe it was the John Singlob Award from the Eagle Forum. So in our next show, I think we're going to go back to that and focus in on that as another aspect of tying in this a direct possible Russian criminal mafia network tie into September 11th, and just in general, the desire for better relations with Russia and how a lot of this split within the Zionist community, I think, has a lot to do with whether or not, the U.S. is going to be the purveyor of global power, whether it's going to be Israel via, say, a shiftward to the east to countries like Russia and China. So I think we'll get into that in our next show. I just wanted to lay a foundation for that. That is going to be kind of a follow-up on what we've been discussing here for our next show.
Yeah, and what's missing in the mix of the geopolitics of all of this is what the interests of we the people, nationally and internationally, which has to do with whether we want mob states, mafia states, where such things as 9/11 can be staged for these international, transnational reasons, with lots of people benefiting from it. So that maybe we'll return back to that. But yeah, so on September 11th this year, I made a phone call into Washington Journal. One Brian Michael Jenkins, who's been held forth as like a key terrorism expert, has a background at the Rand Corporation, but also Kroll. And I brought up two articles that I thought were key for people to read. And one is one that I mentioned before called Mapping Fort Lee, The Truth Behind 9/11. But the other one is called Debunking the 28 Pages, Top Secret 9/11 Document Revealed. This one, the Debunking 28 Pages, is written primarily by Jeff Smith with help from Gordon Duff and Ian Greenhall. And Mapping Fort Lee is written primarily by Gordon Duff. And I'm just going to read a tiny bit from this, from Mapping Fort Lee. Fort Lee, New Jersey played a key role in 9/11. We are mapping out using Google Earth some of the incidents involved in presenting a rational response to the cover-up, both the government version and the amateur quote-unquote aftermarket B-grade version. If you haven't watched the entire video, please do that now. George Washington Bridge. All major roadways in and out of New York were to be destroyed on 9/11. It was these teams brought in from Israel that included the Mohammed Atta group, confirmed as directly tied to both the CIA and Egyptian intelligence, that were under surveillance by a combined task force that coordinated with local law enforcement. So when thousands of pounds of explosives were placed inside the cable anchorage, teams were dispatched to disable these devices as soon as the attack on the World Trade Center began. Simultaneous to the cutting of the cables, a massive truck bomb, as described in CBS and CNN news reports and police radio intercepts, was to explode. As heard, police reported this truck did explode, taking down the roadway supports, thus dropping the bridge, quote-unquote, like a rock into the Hudson River. The tunnels. By the way, isn't it interesting how much we've heard of the so-called dancing Israelis, and how little we've heard about this question of the targeting of George Washington Bridge. And by the way, I heard Gordon Duff say that the George Washington Bridge was also where the key fiber connection to Wall Street ran, and thus that there was very likely a plan to disrupt the entire U.S. financial system potentially, and break down the SWIFT system and all of that. And so 9/11 was even more major than we saw. And meanwhile, you have the yes, it's an important piece, this celebrating Israelis, but they were apparently just one of multiple groups of Israeli operatives that were arrested, and some with explosives and intent to destroy things rather than just celebrate things. The tunnels, back to the story. Both the Holland and Lincoln tunnels were to be demolished. We have only one arrest confirmation from the Manhattan side. NYPD roadblocks at the Lincoln Tunnel chased down a van that did a quick turnaround to avoid arrest. 2 suspects were arrested with weapons and a truck filled with explosives. Police Commissioner Bernie Kerik, recently released from prison, was on the scene with his personal counterterrorism squad to take custody. They were never seen since. And I want to touch on Kerik really briefly in a little bit. But last bit from this article, Fort Lee. Fort Lee is the real staging ground for 9/11. It was chosen for a good reason. News reports from 9/11 have been eliminated from archives. Lists of terrorists caught, then released at the orders of New York City and White House officials and flown out of the country are gone. Police who made the arrests recorded above are under gag order. Moreover, a vast support network involved in the preparation, planning, and support of the 9/11 attacks, including the many unsuccessful attacks, not only are enjoying their freedom, some are among the most powerful Americans. As stated, 9/11 begins in Fort Lee, New Jersey. The condo and co-op community there is the home of one of the largest and most politically powerful Israeli first groups in America, including key members of the notorious organization JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, reputed to be more influential than PNAC, Project for a New American Century, and far more militant. An examination of JINSA shows it to be organized in cells like a terror group. Is it a surprise that the George Washington Bridge, Fort Lee's primary landmark, and the view sought by the residents of the high-rises chosen for planting the radio jammers was scheduled for a dramatic demolition on 9/11 with hundreds of commuter vehicles slated for the bottom of the Hudson River? The Fort Lee Mafia. Since 1930s, Fort Lee has been a mob town with the beginnings of Murder, Inc. and the Albert Anastasia Gang and Joe Adonis. It all began when New York Mayor LaGuardia threw the mob out of New York. The new George Washington Bridge provided a home for the mob in Fort Lee, with gambling clubs lining the Palisades on both sides of the GW Bridge. And so this is also then just one last thing here. The fall of communism saw Russian-Ukrainian organized crime come to New Jersey, settling in Fort Lee. The Taiwanchik Trincher Group, that's who I mentioned before, Trincher, is an amalgamation of Israeli, Ukrainian, Cypriot gangs operating illegal gambling operations throughout the United States with ties to the Romney-Bain Financial Group. And then it talks about an indictment in the Manhattan court of the Taiwanchik Trincher organization, which, by the way, I believe was brought by Preet Bharara, which I think there's no coincidence here that Trump is going after all these people that investigated and put away some of these mobsters. And then the local terror cell's role in number 1, vehicles for hauling explosives. 2, access to transit authority facilities, vehicles, and personnel for planting explosives. 3, cooperation with local condo co-op security, assuring unfettered access to rooftops. And in our last minute here, I just want to point out what maybe we can cover a little bit more next time, is debunking the 28 pages top secret 9/11 document revealed. This allegedly is from the FBI Able Danger part. It's classified top secret about 9/11. This is who the FBI believe was responsible for 9/11. And on the top side, you have all of what the sort of the limited hangout about the 28 pages refers to: Bandar Bush's wife, Bayoumi, Osama Basnan, Hazmi Al-Midar, Osama bin Laden. But then on the bottom half, you see things like the Jewish Agency Board of Governors, one Eitan Wertheimer, who gave Bernie Kerik $250,000. And Bernie Kerik was in Israel in the weeks right before 9/11. Then you have Steve Witkoff, who is a former real estate lawyer for Donald Trump and one of Donald Trump's big public boosters, who also gave Bernard Kerik a payoff. So this is who the FBI and Able Danger actually believes was involved in September 11th operation in the New York area. So like we said, 9/11 to 11/9. Antidote, we out.
Till next time.